This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Alec Ross. He is an expert in innovation, a partner at a venture capital firm, once ran for political office. He has a very strong understanding of American politics. I like to think I do as well. Now, with all fairness, I've not worked with inside a presidential administration. He has, so he knows some of the players up close and personal. Now, of course, it will be obvious that we both come from different sides of the spectrum in this conversation, but it's an important conversation. His new book, The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future. We both agree there is a fight on right now, and we both don't know how it will end up. So please sit back and enjoy a conversation, a back and forth, a debate, maybe even close to an argument about where we're headed and if we can pull back from the abyss. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Alec Ross. You're probably going to kick me for this. I'm assuming you're going to say you liked this, but I am a first-time watcher of The Wire in the last 6 weeks.
I detest The Wire.
Oh, interesting. Let me keep going on for a second. So I had never seen it. I've always had this feeling, because I've had to go to Baltimore for business several times in the last 5 years. My feeling always when I'm in Baltimore is like, wow, maybe zombies are going to jump out from behind a bush. It feels dystopian in many parts of Baltimore. When I saw The Wire, I thought to myself, well, I'm not so sure it even shows what's going on in terms of my feeling when I walk. But I thought it was a really good show. I mean, your former boss, as you mentioned, Obama, I think it's his favorite show. So isn't that interesting? You got a guy on the line right now who's probably a more touch traditional, a more touch conservative, but I really love The Wire.
It's a well-done show, and I know the guy who made it, David Simon. There are two reasons I dislike it. Number one, because people in all 196 countries on planet Earth will oftentimes identify Baltimore with that show. It shows a piece of Baltimore, a very real piece of Baltimore, but it's not all of Baltimore. And the second reason is I used to be an inner city school teacher. And when I watched that show, I felt like I was at work. I felt like I was back in my classroom on the west side of Baltimore. So it wasn't entertainment. It felt like it was taking me back to work.
It's not a fun picture of being a teacher in Baltimore.
No, it's not. I mean, it's a good show. Objectively, it's a good show. I just don't enjoy it.
It's more of an emotional thing with you. You're not really fighting the factual aspect of it. You're more about the emotional part of it.
It's factual for, let's call it 15% of the city. So it's an accurate representation of 15% of the city. I don't know if it's emotional, maybe more psychological than emotional. It takes you into the hood. And I've spent a lot of time in the hood. It's a little tough. My kids go to public schools in Baltimore. They don't go to the hood, but they're definitely in a very mixed, dynamic environment for both good and ill.
You know, as a keen observer, even though my life started off, my public career started off with these investment books, I've always had, as I mentioned to you, a little bit of a political backside, so to speak. And growing up in the DC area, I have watched it grow, watched it change. And I think for people that don't really understand, I mean, like 6 of the wealthiest counties in America, 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America surround DC. It's basically been an on-fire juggernaut ever since arguably the first Gulf War, for sure, since 9/11. The defense contractors, all that stuff has just blown money in there. And it's pretty crazy. That's a little bit of my background, that observation.
Vienna, Virginia,
It's the hotbed.
It's the hotbed. And, defense intelligence, Langley, the headquarters of the CIA, is not far from there. So where you grew up, there are lots of these office buildings with no signs outside, with keyless entry. And a lot of those, the defense contractors, you know who they are. They're just as many intelligence contractors as there are defense contractors. You probably went to high school with the sons and daughters of lots of military and CIA officials.
Yes, for sure. I used to drive by right behind the golf course in Vienna. I can't remember the big guy that was busted by the FBI, the double agent.
Ames.
There was another one. What was the other guy? Hansen.
Yes, that's right. With the Israelis, right?
I thought, no, Aldrich.
Or was he Russian?
Yes, he was Russian and Aldrich was Israeli. But I used to drive by the corner where they did the sting where they arrested him right on the backside of this golf course. You just cut through to get to Tyson's Corner all the time. So every time I drive by that corner, I'm like, yeah, most people don't realize the most famous Russian spy was arrested on that corner. The same sidewalk still there. It's pretty crazy.
So, Michael, are you actually an intelligence agent that's been inserted into the world of capital markets?
That'd be fun, honestly.
Where are you speaking from today, Michael?
I'm in Saigon.
That's right.
The funny thing is I've been doing this podcast. The first year I did it in the States, and then I started traveling on a book tour. Well, actually not even a book tour, just a speaking tour. And banks in Asia. And then I decided to stay in Asia because it was so much fun. And Saigon was the most fun place. Isn't that fun? Let's talk about something. You brought it up when I mentioned Saigon. You said something about the contrast or the comparison to a place like Saigon and a place like Baltimore. I don't want to just pick on Baltimore because I would say that I can walk anywhere in Saigon, day or night, and be safe. And that is surely not the case in almost every big American city. I don't think I've heard a gunshot in 7 or 8 years, ever. I've never heard a gunshot. You say, well, why would an American guy go stay in a place like that? Well, you're hearing part of the reason right now. How does that make you feel when you hear that?
Well, first of all, not surprised at all. Doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, when I wrote this book, The Raging 2020s, the rage that I was talking about, you don't find in the streets of Saigon. You do find it in the streets of Baltimore. You do, for that matter, find it in the cornfields of Nebraska. But I think that the degree to which places like Saigon are leaning into the future and cities like Baltimore are rooted in a really regressive industrial past produce all of these byproducts, one of which is violence in places like Baltimore. So you're saying that doesn't surprise me at all. I lived last year in Bologna, Italy. I was teaching at the world's oldest university, the University of Bologna. And I have a 16-year-old daughter and 14-year-old son. They could go wherever they wanted at any hour with their little wolf pack of friends. I wouldn't give it a second thought. In Baltimore, much more attentive to it. They simply can't just go out and run around.
Yeah, once you taste that, it's hard to go back. Look, a lot of Americans would be listening and going, hold on, the guy's in Vietnam. What is their form of government? Is that safe? Like, a lot of Americans literally think Rambo's running around or something crazy like that. Once you taste a certain serenity, you don't want what you and I know is going on in so much of America right now. As you say, the word rage. Let me let you contrast, because you brought up two different places. You said the cornfields of Nebraska and the inner cities, for example, of Baltimore. That's two different places. If there is going to be a defined rage for both of those places, it's probably an entirely different rage, isn't it?
Look, they come to different conclusions, but a lot of the origins of the rage come from similar places. I grew up in the coal-filled hills of West Virginia, worked as a midnight janitor in a beer delivery truck. So come from sort of working middle class, rural West Virginia. And it's shocking to me the degree to which the rage back where my parents still live in the hills of West Virginia is similar to what you'll find in the streets of Baltimore. There are some commonalities in why they're angry. They oftentimes draw wildly different conclusions, but then there's some spooky similarities. In Baltimore, there's a lot of heroin and there's a lot of crack cocaine. In the coal-filled hills of West Virginia right now, it is meth. My God, it is like
Oxycontin.
It is opioid central. So they're very different people, very different sets of circumstances, but in each case, the social contract is broken.
Let me throw this out, though, just for definition purposes. I said this once to a professor on this show, and he immediately went crazy on me. But in a place like Baltimore, though, the murder, the hardcore crime will be different than in Omaha. So, I mean, I think we have to be fair to say that some of these places might have a rage that is there and comparable, but when it comes to violence, we definitely have a violence problem in a certain demographic.
We have a gun violence problem.
And a certain demographic, though. It's not just only, we all know the statistics. I don't want to bore you with them. You know them. But it is definitely a certain demographic.
I mean, it is low income. It's Black and it's white. One of the largest steel mills, I think maybe the largest steel mill in the United States, employed over 50,000 people during World War II. It was a Bethlehem steel mill in Sparrows Point, just east of Baltimore. And if you go there, it is majority white, but it is every bit as violent as the communities you're watching on The Wire that are inner city and Black. When you say a demographic, the demographic is low income.
So let me give an example, a little bit of a personal example. So my father, he's into construction growing up and building our own house and all that kind of stuff. One of his good friends that became one of his good friends was a guy named, grew up in Baltimore. He used to tell me all kinds of stories, Black guy. Here, you and I, two white guys, just to put everything in context. He used to tell me all kinds of stories. And I'd say, well, listen, you've broken away. You've developed all kinds of interesting relationships. You worked with the Redskins. You became good friends with Joe Gibbs, all kinds of ministry stuff. Why did your family, why did they not escape Baltimore like you did? He wanted something different. So I give that bit of a setup just so you don't think I'm throwing pot shots when I'm about to get a little more definitional. If we look at the statistics, it's almost like, okay, if we're going to, just to bring it even more controversial, if we're going to look at something like COVID today, COVID definitely affects the obese people more. So people that are dealing with obesity, COVID's got much worse circumstances. Okay, if we look at gun violence, we know that about 6% Black men commit about 50% of the gun homicides. Why do we have such a hard time in America getting that specific? Because if we don't get that specific, how do we solve the problem? How do we help all these guys?
Well, I don't know. When you say get that specific, I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, data is data. When you say get that specific, do you mean why do we not talk about it? What does that mean? In my world, we understand it. We discuss it. There are robust debates about it. So what do you mean when you say get that specific?
Well, okay, for example, you said gun violence. You used the phrase gun violence. Okay. Most of regular suburbia, there is not a gun violence problem that's anywhere comparable to a Chicago or Baltimore. So I feel like America, sometimes we get into these kind of like big macro ways of describing things like gun violence. Well, okay, hold on. It's a gun violence problem in an overwhelmingly worse way in certain areas with certain demographics. That's what I mean.
No, I mean, that's a fair point. I don't know that that's a contested point.
You're very reasonable today. I thought maybe you were going to be fighting out of the block.
I'd be delighted to get into it with you as soon as you say something stupid. But I think you're making points that are rooted in data right now, and there are fair points to make. I mean, and part of what I think is important is to define your argument. Let's talk about school violence. All right. So if you want to focus in on something like school shootings. So what's interesting here is school shootings, of which there is an epidemic of them in the United States, is overwhelmingly suburban. The most famous example, of course, is Columbine.
Those kids were batshit crazy.
Columbine is the Truman Show. It is the very caricature of American suburbia. The city in Connecticut.
That kid was crazy too.
But these are all suburban. Here's my point to you, Michael. Rage manifests itself differently. But when I see, and if we're going to talk about a demographic here, let's talk about a particularly screwed up younger demographic that is perpetrating these acts of school violence, overwhelmingly concentrated, 85+% in Truman Show suburbia. What's interesting is while the rage manifests itself differently, what I am seeing is, but for our wealthiest communities in the United States, the social contract not working especially well right now. And we need to get at the roots of the rage. We need to figure out what to do about it.
To add a little bit of risk management there's no doubt, I cannot debate, you make a perfectly sound point. The Batman kid on The Dark Knight, they're just lunatics. And basically they're white guy loners that have probably been playing video games for too long and they lose touch with reality and they go kill a bunch of people. That said, from a risk management standpoint, the overall numbers, while it's a terrible situation, does not compare to the overall nonstop violence in our inner cities. Definitely, from your perspective, the argument you're making, it's a rage issue. Let's open this up to probably the most important issue, which is the technology, because there's no doubt that's this technology, all this, we're wired together and we're watching all this stuff nonstop and everyone's in their silos. That could be the good, that could be bad, but let's talk about big tech right now. What is your perspective on big tech?
So the first thing on big tech is I think it's a little intellectually lazy sometimes when people take all of these companies and put them in a single basket. What do I mean by this? I mean, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple, they're all similar in terms of market power, but their businesses are actually very different. Their effects on our economic lives, and to go back to our previous discussion, our psychological lives are very different. So the first thing I would say about big tech, Michael, is let's be more definitional. Are we talking about Facebook? Are we talking about Apple? Are we talking about Amazon? So they're all different. I ran tech policy for Obama's first presidential campaign for 4 years when he was president. I ran the innovation agenda within the State Department's foreign policy. I guess I see these firms less as a unified whole than as some individualized players. And within that, I think there are some better actors and there are some more malignant actors. And in some cases, if you want to talk about things like antitrust, I think some things are more reasonable than they are with others. But I guess when we talk about big tech, I think Chinese big tech is all one thing, because Chinese big tech is overwhelmingly driven by the geopolitics of Beijing. But American big tech, I don't think of as one thing.
Let me play devil's advocate. Let me give the skeptical point of view. Let me pretend one of my diehard right-wing friends is sitting next to me. Their response would be, hold on, if I look at Facebook and Google and Apple and Twitter and Amazon, I'm seeing a group, all five, that are aligned politically with one party. I mean, I think that it's a fair statement to say that 50% of America believes that. And I think it's also probably fair to say there's a lot of evidence that supports that.
I think in Facebook, I completely disagree with you. Mark Zuckerberg is no Democrat. Sheryl Sandberg historically has ties to Democrats, but she is reviled by most Democrats. The head of their government public policy, Nick Clegg, is no Democrat. If you look at their board of directors, it's overwhelmingly right-wing. Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel. There is nothing democratic at this point about Facebook. So I would pull them out of that. If we're talking about Apple, I think that is, especially when you think about its employee base, much more aligned with Democrats. Twitter, Jack Dorsey is a little bit of a lunatic. I mean, he is a sort of lefty libertarian crypto guy. I imagine the management, including the board there, is more Democratic. So again, I would go sort of company by company. Facebook, no way in hell are they Democratic. I mean, Joel Kaplan, who runs global public policy for them, really close to Trump, worked in the George W. Bush White House. Kevin Martin was the FCC chair under Republicans. So Facebook is pretty Republican and right-wing right now.
I don't know if most people would agree. I mean, the only person that really matters for Facebook is Zuckerberg because he owns all the voting shares. So as Facebook goes, that's all Mark Zuckerberg.
Zuckerberg is no Democrat. Who hates Mark Zuckerberg more than AOC and more than the Democrats in the Senate right now?
Fair point, and then we're going to get into that in a second. But I'll tell you something, though, in terms of, it's the only platform that I think right now that I'm censored on. I'm not censored on an issue that is a conservative issue. I'm not a flamethrower or a bomb thrower or anything, but if I have any analysis on Facebook that involves the current pandemic, there's an attachment to that. That's not conservative.
It's not liberal either.
It's not liberal either.
No, but you're making my point for me, Michael. I mean, you're absolutely making my point.
So what is it then? Is it totalitarian? Is that, what is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
It is a dictatorship. It's authoritarian.
The people that are hearing that you worked in the Obama administration, you're openly saying that something like Facebook is taking, I'm not going to say the people are totalitarian yet, but they're taking totalitarian type actions. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. I mean, look, there's no democratic consent. We are governed in many cases, and I write about this a lot in the Raging 2020s, we are more governed by companies than by countries. The terms of service at Facebook, which apparently, Michael, they think you violate when you publish about COVID, you are governed by the terms of service at Facebook without democratic consent, without due process, without democratic norms. That makes it inherently totalitarian, given the power of these platforms. That's why I write that in many cases, we're more governed by companies than we are by countries. Amazon is a country. Apple's a country. Facebook's a country. Google's a country. Their CEOs are more powerful than 75% of the heads of state in the world.
Why, given your background, you seem very reasonable and you seem to be giving a fair side perspective, 360-degree perspective. Why does it seem like right now that the, quote, American left is leaning into the idea of censorship? Because look, I grew up in a time where, think back to the 80s, and it would have been like, okay, ACLU has got another case that they're going to get this individual rights thing done, and the whole country is going to have to bow down to this one guy. And everyone kind of was like, but you know what? It would set the standard for that individual has rights. And now it seems like that part of the left in America has gone somewhere else.
What I want to do is bring some nuance to this. So when we say the left, first, let's talk about censorship and what you mean. So I think that there are two different things here that I think you could call censorship. First, and let me go through both of them. The first is, let's call it taking people off of social media platforms and saying what people are and are not allowed to say. The second is wokeism. If you say something outside of the norms of political correctness, you will be canceled, you will be censored. So for the purposes of this conversation, Michael, which of those two are you talking about? Because they're both different. Or are you talking about both?
Well, yeah, I guess it all kind of blends together. There's no doubt that there is a certain form of, let's say, deplatforming. From what I can tell, that's definitely taking out or deleting what we might otherwise call conservative or right content. I don't think this is a big problem of left type content in America being taken down. In terms of wokeism, my gosh, I guess maybe we should save that. That's definitely a left ballywick, so to speak. I mean, that's
a couple things. So you're talking about deplatforming, and I'm happy to talk about that. If you don't mind my being really open with you here, Michael, this left versus the right binary, I don't know that that's terribly descriptive of the world we live in right now.
It might be descriptive of America, maybe.
I think the principal political and economic binary of yesterday's world was left versus right. And the principal political and economic binary of today and tomorrow's world is more open versus closed. But let's go to the issue that you brought up, which is deplatforming. What you would call, and this is a reasonably debatable point, what you call censorship, the platforms would call violations of terms of service. This is exactly what I was talking about, where we are more governed by companies than by countries, because what you are or are not allowed to say in a public square, going back to what's rooted in our Constitution, is different than what a company has the right to do within its terms of service. The big question here becomes, what form of democratic consent has to be placed on the owners of these platforms? Do they own public squares or do they own private squares? I mean, what do you think, Michael? Are those public squares or are they private squares?
You can speak to the legal protection they have right now, but my understanding is that they do have a certain amount of protection. You can speak to that, but I think also, too, the monopoly side of this, who can start right now with the power Facebook has? Who can start a competing social media platform?
You sound like a good lefty, Michael. I mean, this is a very progressive left-wing view of yours.
Look, at the end of the day, if some of these platforms, these companies that I'm mentioning, if they arguably have, and I think so, have a left bias, let's say people on the left are enjoying perhaps that power, I would say, well, hold on. What happens one day if it flips? It flips around on you and they go to a right bias. That's the danger of this.
Michael, I would just counsel you, again, you're rooting this very much in left versus right. And the point that I made, and I think you agreed to earlier, was we're talking about Facebook, for example. That's not a left-wing organization. It is a totalitarian organization. I counsel you to think about this differently than left and right.
Did not though, in the last presidential campaign, did not Mr. Zuckerberg spend a sizable amount of money through assorted nonprofits making sure the candidate of the left could win. I think he did.
No, I don't know that he did. One thing I do know is that, and again, don't put me in the position of defending Facebook here. The counterpoint being made right now is that if you look at the Facebook algorithm, what it consistently does, Ben Shapiro, for example, has become sort of a god of Facebook, and all of the Ben Shapiros out there. If you look at the top 20 presences on Facebook on any given day, about 17 of them are of a political nature and are politically conservative. And that's because of its algorithm. So its algorithm does this tremendous job of amplification of views from the right. So on the left, and again, I hate this right versus left because I do think it's intellectually lazy. On the left, the critique is, why is it that every single day, 9 out of the 10 top postings on Facebook coming from the political right? And it's because of an algorithm generated in substantial part through the influence of the head of the Facebook Public Policy Office, which is run by Joel Kaplan and Kevin Martin, two former Republican officials. Ultimately, I think that this is not a partisan issue. I think if and how big tech is going to be regulated and the individual platforms within them, there have to be points of consensus about what within these platforms should be regulated and what should not.
Just so a little more perspective on my view here, I would probably go back and say that the actions that happened after 9/11 under a Republican administration, those actions and all that legislation enacted, all that surveillance state and all that kind of stuff, I mean, that's all a part of building the foundation to where we are today. And there's nothing about what took place under Bush Jr. do I like. I mean, the fake war in Iraq, the killing of millions of kids that no one's ever counted. I'm in a country right now that I did not understand. Look, all I'd ever seen growing up in America was, 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. That's all I heard. I'd go to the memorial, I saw that. You come to a place like Vietnam and you're like, well, hold on. We killed 3 or 4 million people. Then you start to realize, wow, that's just not even talked about in America. So I don't want you to pigeonhole me either.
No. Look, you're a smart guy. You're a smart person, Michael. So I wouldn't pigeonhole you here. What I would say, and let's talk, you just did a really important job invoking the Vietnam War. Let's remember that you can pretty much divide the fatalities that took place in Vietnam, including among Vietnamese people, into 2, half of which took place under a Democratic president, Lyndon Johnson, and half of which took place under a Republican president, Richard Nixon. The Vietnam War, for example, is a crystal clear example of what there actually was there was a governing consensus that traversed left and right. LBJ was the father of the single largest expansion of the welfare state in the last 80 years in the United States. And Richard Nixon, with Henry Kissinger at his elbow, would hardly be considered a dove. So that's an example of how I think a lot of these grand challenges traverse political parties. I mean, you just mentioned the surveillance state that came up after 9/11. The Patriot Act was passed with largely bipartisan support. Very little of it was undone after Obama became president. The Patriot Act, the legal mechanism for connecting massive amounts of data, has actually now survived. It's into its 4th presidency. George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. Those are 4 presidents, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. This is part of why on these big issues, I think we shouldn't divide things between left and right, because a lot of the bigger issues are actually systemic.
You bring up an issue, too, that gets into a term that some people don't like, but I would make the argument after doing my homework that we'll never know that JFK would not have done what LBJ did, and that perhaps LBJ was more easily swayed under the nascent deep state and the defense contractors than JFK would have been. There's no doubt that Nixon continued what LBJ started. I think all the things we're talking about right now today, if people are kind of wondering what's the thread, I think all of these things have been pushing us, frankly, since maybe even arguably JFK's assassination. And then what happened in the Vietnam War, sordid stock crashes and the 2 Iraq wars and all this other stuff. And we get to this point with COVID, we really are at a rage point, aren't we? I mean, I think you and I are laying the foundations. Okay, everyone has to admit, yes, we are definitely at this rage point. and what to do, how to turn back. I mean, how do you say it? We could either go Star Trek or Mad Max.
Star Trek or Mad Max. We've been in this now for 50 years.
Yeah.
We spent trillion with a T, $1 trillion in Afghanistan.
Terrible.
Look what's there right now. The American people are incredibly sick of our spending huge amounts of money in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, building skyscrapers in suburban Washington, chock-a-block full of defense contractors, at the expense of investments in infrastructure, education, reducing our debt, addressing other problems. And it really angers people. I think that this is something that cuts across the political spectrum. I talk in terms of the social contract. There have been times in America's past and in humanity's past where about every 150 years, we sort of reorient the relationship between state capital and labor, between governments, citizens, and businesses. And I think we've arrived at one of those moments again where people broadly want to see non-incremental change. They don't want to see little changes at the edges. They want to see fundamental changes.
You mentioned the cost of the Afghanistan war. And I mentioned growing up in Vienna, Virginia. If people want to check, they can. Zip code 22180. Essentially, in the early 1990s, a house in Vienna, Virginia, on probably 16,000 square feet of land would have gone for maybe $200,000. That same piece of land with a new McMansion today is around $1.8 to $2 million. And this is a 4-mile square town in suburbia. Nothing special about it at all. But there is a great example of where this money has gone. We spent all this money in Afghanistan. Well, hold on. I had to pay all these contractors and whatnot. And I think this is the part that's really unnerving for me, is just growing up in that area, is just to see how much money is poured into there. And you'll see where I'm going with this, is arguably how much really changes in America when we change a president or when we change Congress versus the administrative state that some people might like to call the deep state.
Let me make 2 points on this. The first, to your point about the home prices in Vienna and my point about the $1 trillion spent in Afghanistan, this is what actually connects inner city Baltimore and rural Nebraska. Because, as I write pretty extensively in the raging 2020s, rural America and the very notion of a family farmer has collapsed in the last 40 years. And similarly, we've seen many American inner cities implode. Meanwhile, we're spending $1 trillion in Afghanistan. But what's interesting to me is, I think in economic terms, is to think about that $1 trillion, where that could have otherwise gone. It largely goes to buying stuff that ends up in places like Kabul, and to the extent that they're capital beneficiaries, they're people buying McMansions in Vienna, Virginia. To your point about the deep state or the administrative state, having worked at a senior level at the State Department, I was a presidential appointee. I reported directly to the Secretary of State. I think there are two things here. I think, first of all, it is absolutely legitimate to point to the inertia within government. Bodies at rest tend to stay at rest. Bodies in motion tend to stay in motion. And the quote unquote administrative state is a body in motion. It is something oriented toward building things the way it's always been done. One of the chapters in the Raging 2020s is about this. Pledgeocracy. The second thing, though, is I would say the administrative state, or what some people call the deep state, is not just in the state. It is this rotating cast of characters who move in and out of government. So it would be a mistake to just say it's people with a .gov email address. It's anybody who moves in and out of government, and or everybody whose principal economic activity is with government. I write pretty extensively about why we need to reorient that toward taking American taxpayers' dollars and focusing it on communities, urban, suburban, and rural, where investments of taxpayer dollars produce a greater unit of public good.
Before we keep breaking things down and diving into details, what is your gut feel right now? I have terrible gut feels. As a guy in my early 50s, I have terrible gut feels about America right now. Compromise for the sake of compromise doesn't make any sense. It just seems like a fist fight right now.
I mean, fist fight is a polite way of putting it. It is tribal. When I was growing up, I didn't know the political affiliations of like my friends' parents.
For sure. Same.
You go into a little league game, you're sitting in the stands, you're not talking about partisan politics. That would have been weird. But now people are all walking around almost with a white hat or a black hat on, or a red hat or a blue hat. And it's incredibly destructive. America is not at one of its best moments right now by a long shot. But let me go to this. You asked me about my gut feel. Part of why I wrote The Raging 2020s is because I do believe we're at a moment of inflection where we have a choice to make. Whether the future looks more like Mad Max or more like Star Trek depends on a series of choices that we make over the next few years. If things remain the same, then the rage will continue. The violent protest movements we've seen across the political spectrum will grow larger and more mainstream. The defining character of this decade will be rage. On the other hand, if, as has been the case for us in the past, we come out of the depths of where we are right now and we rebuild, I think that we can reset our trajectory. Let's go back to the 1920s. Let's go back to the roaring 20s. After the economic collapse at the end of the 1920s, different countries made different choices. Germany went toward Nazism. Italy went toward fascism. The United States went to the New Deal. Hugely different results for each. I feel like in many respects, we're at another point of transition where we're going to choose who we are, what our soul is politically and economically. It's an open question what that is, but I choose to be optimistic. If for no other reason, then that's sort of how I'm wired.
Let me throw you back into the fire, so to speak. It's difficult to put out a book like this right now when we're in the middle of the firestorm, so to speak, because things are kind of seem like they're heating up on a daily basis. COVID has presented a unique challenge, and I've had the chance to observe this challenge being in Asia. A lot of lockdowns and masks and stuff like that. Far less cases of death in many places of Asia, and I don't think there's any doubt that that probably is directly related to obesity. I've been keenly observing, and I don't know if you've seen any of it, but keenly observing what's going on in Australia. And Australia also, like America, has an obesity problem. And I can probably guess that a lot of the leaders there are thinking, wow, if we let this thing get out, we're going to see a certain amount of death, maybe not unlike America. There's a lot of heavy-handed stuff going on in Australia right now. I think a lot of people in America might say, well, gosh, the idea of a vaccine mandate is heavy-handed. How do you look at this? Because it seems like not only are you writing about the raging 2020s, it's accelerating on a daily basis. And I think we've really not discussed how I think the rage is taking off in COVID in ways that none of us could expect.
You're right, Michael. And suffice to say, this was a well-timed book. I started writing it before COVID, but COVID really served as two things. One, as a validation of it, but then two, as an accelerant of it. It really has accelerated a lot of the things that were already taking place, but it added a zero to it. Heavy-handed. It's interesting. I look at the countries that are managing this much more effectively than the United States. You want to know what makes me angry is self-destructive behavior of a lot of Americans. People who have chosen to say whether you wear a mask or not is a political statement oriented with one affiliation or another. For me, whether you get a vaccine or not, for me is an IQ test. It had never been the case previously that being vaccinated was associated with something of a partisan political nature. The fact that it is now something that is partisan and political, I think, is an example showing just how broken America is in certain respects right now. We almost uniquely in the world right now have stupidly turned something like vaccination into something that is partisan as opposed to really, really simple science.
I think it's fair to say where that started, the hesitancy and the I don't want to do this started in the fall of 2020. That really came from the mouth of the current president and the current vice president who said, you know, if a vaccine comes from the then President Trump, the vaccine comes from him. I'm not into this. I'm not taking it. And then getting into office, things changed. this is kind of getting at the rub of where things are breaking down. For example, and I said this to somebody else recently, I watched Dr. Fauci go out and throw a pitch at the Nationals game to throw out the first pitch. And he puts the mask on. And then he's in the stands later eating a hot dog with his friends, not wearing a mask. You hear the back and forth of we need a mask, we don't need a mask. Again, I've told you where I've been, so you know we've had to deal with the mask a lot. It's kind of cultural already in Asia, so it's like you roll with the punches, whatever. But it's the hypocritical part that is causing, at least inside this COVID conversation, the rage.
Well, I think that's certainly part of it. I also think that part of it comes from the number of people who are dying, the number of people who are now 6 feet underground because of an irresponsible news and information environment. So the fact that whether vaccines work or not is a highly debated point is an indictment of our news and information environment. Do they work? Yes. They absolutely positively work. You can look at all of the data in the world. And if you choose not to take a vaccine because you think they don't work, you're painfully misinformed. I think the rage comes from that. I think it also comes from a lot of dead people. What the effect of that is. My daughter has a high school classmate whose grandfather just died. He was always one of these who's like, I'm free. I believe in my right to not follow all these stupid rules. You know what? He was older and now he's dead. I do think that the body count has a lot to do with this as well.
Yeah, I think the nonstop fear, I saw something the other day, they were talking about in America, the understanding of who is getting sick and dying on a percentage basis, and the difference between what Democratic voters and Republican voters thought, that if you got COVID and your percent chance to die, Democratic voters thought their percent chance to die was dramatically higher than Republican voters. I could think, well, okay, do I give that credit to CNN? You know, is CNN, they had the death ticker for so long. I mean, it is a back and forth tennis match volley almost in a way about how do you get to the essence of what this is. I think the thing that scares me the most is, I don't know if I'm feeling the exact American rage being outside of America right now, but the concern that I'm feeling are the restrictions. That America always had this freedom, and the restrictions are coming fast and furious now.
It's funny you should say that. I just got back last night from Italy. I spend about half of my time in Italy. They've got it figured out there. They were one of the first places hit in the world with COVID. They really bore the brunt of it. Now, their cases of COVID and their death rates are a fraction of what they are in the United States, and they have substantially fewer restrictions and much more freedom. And it's because they've done the thing that we in the United States should have done. Here we are, we created these vaccines, but what they've done in Italy and what they've done in much of Europe right now is they've created what they call in Italy a green pass. If you either A, are vaccinated, or B, test, then you've got something on your cell phone with a QR code that says, yeah, you know, you can go to the disco, you can go to the football game, you can go to the restaurant. You don't have to wear a mask. Life is normal so long as you have your green pass. Where Americans are stupid is they say, that is Big Brother. I shouldn't have to have a QR code. It's just kind of like, fine. Then there are going to be all these regulations that take away our freedom. Sometimes we need to use our technology and our science and our brains and enable us to live with freedom in COVID, like the Italians have figured out, like how a lot of Asian states have figured out. It's a lot of people's stubbornness rooting themselves in an argument of freedom that they don't even understand that is keeping people from being able to be free right now.
Why are, and I'm seeing this a little bit where I am, there's a certain tribalism around it. So in Vietnam, for example, your freedom is granted, so to speak, if you have the 2 vax or you have natural immunity. I don't understand why the vaxxed people are scared of the unvaxxed people. That's another irrational part of this. Gotten more vaccinations in my life that I can count. I had to get a ton to come to Asia. But most vaccinations were on a very long schedule. It wasn't like a jam it through in 1 year kind of thing. That's for sure. But why right now are people Does this mean we have to redefine the term vaccination? Why are so many people that have been vaccinated scared of the unvaccinated?
This is one of those things I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on. So you asked me the question, I'll give you my best guess. I think it's because of all of the reporting of breakthrough cases. If I had to guess, I would guess that it's that. And this goes back to the news and information environment, where if you read the news, you would think that vaccines don't work. Everybody's getting a breakthrough case. You've been vaccinated, but you got COVID. So I think it's probably because we've given way too much attention to breakthrough cases, meaning people who have been vaccinated, but who have gotten the Delta variant, instead of placing them within their accurate mathematical context. It comprises, I don't know the percent, whatever percentage of 1% of infections. And the other thing we have to do is point out, I mean, look, Michael, you've spoken out pretty loudly about the effect of things like obesity and what have you on morbidity and hospitalization. Part of what we have to do a better job of, too, is making clear that even if there's something like a reinfection, if you are vaccinated, you are not going to end up in the hospital. You are not going to die. And in fact, what is far likelier to determine serious illness are a variety of other factors, including, as you've pointed out, obesity. We've been talking for almost an hour now, and this has been sort of a fil rouge, a motif throughout our conversation. It's a polluted news and information environment. So if you're always saying, 10 new breakthrough cases, and that's the screaming headline, but if all 10 people have the sniffles, and or if those are 10 out of a million, then it's irresponsible journalism.
Here's where I want to go on that kind of a final thought. You brought up the media, and I think perhaps this is the most important point. And I'm going to say something that's a little political, but I think there's an even bigger issue beyond what I say that's political. I think right now in America, we do have primarily a left-leaning media system. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's pretty balanced. I mean, if you look at the largest news broadcasts by far, Fox eats the lunch of CNN, MSNBC. You can put those together and Fox is much bigger. If you look at newspapers right now, newspapers 20, 25 years ago were dominantly center left. Now, because of the private equity firms that have bought up a lot of the biggest newspapers, from the Los Angeles Times to the Chicago Tribune, most others, it's largely oriented center right. But here's the big point for me. In the raging 2020s, there are certain words that I just banned from the text. The word Trump, the word Obama, Clinton, Biden, none of these words appear.
I searched for them, by the way. I searched for them.
Yeah. You can't find them because at the end of the day, I want people to think about these issues. If you want to go watch 30 minutes from a left-leaning perspective, you can go watch a show on MSNBC. If you want to go watch it from a right-leaning perspective, go watch it on Fox. What I'm trying to do is get us to elevate a little bit more. And going back to, the time when you were growing up in Virginia and I was growing up in West Virginia, if you're sitting in the stands at a Little League game, adults could have conversations without it becoming of a sort of tribal political nature. I want to go back to talking and engaging like that. All of these political issues and partisan issues are incredibly relevant. But I also feel like we Americans are better than that when we can find common ground on Afghanistan. If you ask people who are Democrats or Republicans 20 years ago and push a button, yes or no, should we spend the next 20 years investing $1 trillion of taxpayer dollars in Afghanistan, at the end of which the Taliban will return to power? Who do you think? I mean, nobody. I feel like we need to go back to having common sense on a lot of different issues where the political class that traverses both Democrats and Republicans may orient us in one direction, but where the American people might orient us in another direction. Ask, would you rather build a school in Afghanistan or would you rather build a school in Nebraska? American people say, how about we build that school in Nebraska? If they say, hey, we're going to pave a road in Baghdad or we're going to pave a road in Baltimore, the American people are going to say, how about we pave that road in Baltimore? And that's not to say that we ought to regress from the world. It's not. For me, it's like, how do we use American hard-earned tax dollars in a responsible way? And what is the common ground we can find so that we aren't just tribal?
You make very pragmatic arguments. I think you would get a lot of people listening. But then I think when people go back and they look at their positions, so to speak, they're going to harden. You would not have written this book if you did not think there was a chance we could go Mad Max.
Look, if I thought it was kumbaya, we're going to be fine, no reason for me to write this book. I mean, I'm a board partner in a venture capital fund with more than $1 billion of assets under management. I just go make more money, continue to make more money. Look, I have a good life. I live a really good life. Writing a book like this, in part, is a recognition that it could go Mad Max on us. And to suggest otherwise, it would be me being intellectually lazy. It would be me being irresponsible. So you're absolutely right, Michael. I mean, we could go Hutu versus Tutsi. We could go Mad Max. We are capable of becoming a permanently divided country. We've gone to war within this country once before. If you said it's a second civil war impossible, it's absolutely not impossible. We've got to mend the United States if any of us are going to live better lives.
Well, I'll give you props. You are trying and you're putting forth the effort to do the mending. I don't know if there's enough other people out there with you. It'll be interesting to see how things unfold. The book, The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future. It's a lot of in-depth stuff. You've gone into a lot of different territory. We only skimmed the surface today, but I think at least we raised and put the topics out there, the things people are thinking about, the different sides they're thinking about. And this is all part of it. If there's going to be something hopeful that can happen, I think there needs to be much more of this kind of dialogue. And look, you watch a lot of things. You know a lot of people. How many conversations like you and I have just had exist in the public sphere today? Not many.
Too few, way too few.
Hey, great stuff. Where can we send people for the book, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff? Is there a website you want to direct people to?
I would say they can find it on Amazon or they can go to alecross.com.
Cool. Alec, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on today.
No, great conversation, and take good care and enjoy Vietnam.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.